The last native warrior defends sacred land from colonizers. The morning mist coiled through the whispering valley like the breath of sleeping spirits. From his perch on the sunstone ledge, Ahanu watched it swirl around the ancient moss-draped pines. He knew each one, the bent sister who survived the great fire, the tall grandfather who had witnessed his own birth. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and cedar, a sacred perfume that held the memories of his people. He was the last guardian of this place, a solitary steward of a land woven from the souls of his ancestors. Peace was his vigil, a quiet trail he walked from sunup to sundown. But this dawn, a discordant note broke the ancient harmony. It was not the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a deer, but a rhythmic, violent chopping. Ahanu's gaze narrowed, sweeping the dense green canopy until he saw it. A plume of unfamiliar smoke, gray and greasy, rising from the valley floor near the sacred river. He moved with a silence the forest itself had taught him, a shadow flowing over rock and root. As he drew closer, the sound grew, the grating shriek of metal on wood, the splintering crack of a life ending too soon. He peered through a curtain of ferns and his heart turned to stone. Men with faces like pale rock and hair like sun-scorched grass were hacking at the tall grandfather. Their axes rose and fell with brutal efficiency, leaving wounds that bled golden sap. They were carving a road, a raw, muddy scar that bled into the pristine earth, caring nothing for the spirits they disturbed or the history they erased. They were not taking, they were consuming. In that moment, the guardian died and the warrior was reborn. The peace in Ahanu's soul did not shatter, but hardened, solidifying into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. He was the last echo of his tribe's song, the final memory of this sacred way. They would not silence him. He gripped the worn leather of his father's bow, the wood smooth and familiar against his palm. His trail was no longer one of peace. It was now the trail of war. Ahanu did not rush toward the invaders' axes. Fury had to be honed, not simply unleashed. He melted back into the trees and took the hidden path, a trail marked by stones only he knew how to read, leading to the Cave of Echoes. The entrance was a narrow fissure veiled by a curtain of hanging moss, and the air that breathed from it was cool and ancient. This was the womb of his tribe, the place where warriors had come for generations to speak with their ancestors before a great hunt or a desperate battle. Inside, the only light was a faint luminescence from the damp, mineral-streaked walls. He stripped to his loincloth, his skin prickling in the sacred chill. In a small stone bowl, he mixed clay and water, soot, and crushed berries, the colors of his purpose. Black for the forest at midnight, his ally. White for the spirits he would soon walk with. Red for the life of the land he would protect, or the blood he was prepared to spill. With deliberate strokes, he painted the symbols on his skin, the jagged line of the mountain on his brow for endurance, the wings of a hawk across his chest for sight and speed, the coiled serpent on his arm for the sudden, deadly strike. Each mark was a prayer, a story, a shield. He wasn't just Ahanu anymore. He was the rage of the clear-cut forest, the sorrow of the muddied river, the strength of the unshakable mountain. He was every warrior who had ever stood in this cave before him. He gathered his father's bow and a quiver of flint-tipped arrows. He secured the small, keen-edged hatchet to his belt. As he stepped out of the cave, the last rays of sunlight were spearing through the canopy, setting the forest ablaze in fiery color. The invaders would be settling by their fires now, confident in their numbers and their iron. They did not know the forest had chosen its champion. The night was coming, and the hunt was about to begin. The sun bled out behind the western peaks, and the night awakened. Ahanu moved through the twilight, less a man and more a piece of the gathering dark. Below the invaders' camp was an angry, open wound in the dusk. Their fire spat embers at the stars, and their loud, rough voices trampled the sacred silence. They sat in a tight circle, their backs to the forest as if it were a dead wall, not a living, breathing entity that was now watching them. Patience was a weapon his father had taught him to sharpen. From the limb of a black pine, Ahanu studied them. 7 men, 6 by the fire, 1 pacing a short, lazy perimeter. Their tools, axes, saws, and heavy mallets, lay in a careless pile. They believed their strength was in their numbers and their iron. They were wrong. Their weakness was their ignorance. Ahanu slipped a single arrow from his quiver, its flint head sharp enough to slice the wind. He was not aiming for a killing blow. Death was too quick a lesson. Fear was a poison that would fester. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a small, flat stone skipping across a rock face 100 paces to the left of the camp. The sharp clack, clack, clack echoed unnaturally in the quiet. The men by the fire startled, grabbing their long rifles and squinting into the blackness. The sentry turned, taking a few hesitant steps toward the sound. It was all the time Ahanu needed. He drew his bowstring to his cheek, the sinew groaning softly, a sound lost to the chirping crickets. He exhaled, and the arrow flew. It did not sing. It whispered its way through the air and struck the sentry's rifle, pinning the weapon's wooden stock to the thick trunk of a tree he was passing. The force threw the man back, his shout of surprise choked by the impact. Before the others could react, Ahanu dropped from his perch. A flash of movement, a glint of his hatchet severing the thick rope tethering their 2-pack mules. With a sharp slap to their haunches, he sent the frightened animals laden with supplies crashing into the woods. He was gone before the first man reached the pinned empty rifle. From the safety of the ridge, Ahanu watched the chaos. Shouts echoed. Men charged blindly into the trees, only to retreat from the impenetrable dark. They had brought axes to conquer the forest. He had just stolen their supplies and their courage with a single arrow in the night itself. The Whispering Valley was no longer their work site. It was now their trap. The dawn brought no comfort, only a raw, gray light that exposed the invaders' fear. Their confidence had bled out into the night. One man, a burly leader with a fiery beard, kicked at the dirt and rallied his men with curses and promises of vengeance. They would not be cowed by a single, ghost-like savage. They would hunt him. They found the trail easily, too easily. A footprint here, a deliberately bent branch there. It was a clear path leading away from their ruined camp and deeper into the valley. With renewed bravado, they plunged into the forest, their heavy boots trampling ferns and snapping twigs, their passage a noisy violation of the morning calm. They were trackers of a sort, but they only knew how to follow a broken trail, not read a living one. From a ridge above, Ahanu watched them come. He was not fleeing, he was luring. He led them away from the high, dry ground and down into the tangled heart of the valley, where the air grew thick and the ground grew soft. He moved through the terrain like water, silent and sure, while they fought it every step of the way, their frustration growing with every thorn that snagged their clothes and every insect that swarmed their sweat-beaded faces. His chosen destination was a place his people called the Sinking Meadow, a beautiful, sun-dappled clearing that hid a treacherous secret beneath its lush green carpet. The trail he laid for them was a perfect deception, leading directly across its most unstable ground. The red-bearded leader, eyes fixed on a footprint Ahanu had left in a patch of moss, took a confident step forward and sank to his thighs in an instant. The ground gave way with a sickening slurp. He cried out, a mix of shock and terror, and as he struggled, the clinging mud pulled him deeper. Panic erupted. The others scrambled to find solid ground, throwing him branches that snapped and ropes that slipped from his mud-caked hands. It took 4 of them, straining and sinking to their own knees, to finally haul their sputtering, filth-covered leader back to solid earth. Exhausted, demoralized, and caked in black mud, they stood panting in the fading light. Their rifles were clogged, their resolve was gone, and when they looked around, every direction looked the same. The trail had vanished. They were lost. Ahanu watched from the shadows, his face a mask of cold purpose. He hadn't fired an arrow or raised his hatchet. He had simply let the valley itself teach the lesson. As the first owl called out in the coming dusk, the 6 men huddled together, their eyes darting into the darkness. They finally understood. They were not the hunters here. They were the prey. Night fell like a shroud, thick and absolute. The 6 men managed to build a sputtering, smoky fire that seemed to push the darkness back only a few feet, creating a tiny mud pit. Now, hushed, angry accusations were passed between them like a contagion. Ahanu did not need arrows for this hunt. His weapons were the night itself and the echoes of their own voices. From the impenetrable blackness, he began his symphony. First came the sound of a heavy body moving through the brush, circling them, always just beyond sight. Then, a perfect imitation of a cornered lynx's scream pierced the air, a sound that raises the hair on any creature's neck. It was answered only by a deeper, profound silence. The men froze, their knuckles white on their useless rifles. Then Ahanu gave the forest a voice. He had heard them shouting names during their frantic rescue. Now he let the wind carry one. "Thomas," it whispered, a dry, sibilant sound that slipped through the clearing. A man named Thomas jerked his head up. "Who's there? Who said that?" he hissed, his eyes wide with terror. "It was the wind, you fool," another man grunted, though he too shifted closer to the fire. Ahanu circled to the other side of their camp. "Jacob." This time the whisper was lower, sadder. Jacob, a pale young man, scrambled to his feet, pointing a trembling finger at a companion. "That was you! Stop it!" Denials became shouts. Shouts became shoves, their fragile unity shattered. As their arguments reached a fever pitch, Ahanu unleashed his final torment. He perfectly mimicked Jacob's reedy, terrified voice, letting it call out from deep within the trees. "Help! I'm lost! Help me!" The men stared first at the woods, then back at the real Jacob, who stood among them, his face a mask of pure horror. The forest was stealing their voices, their sanity. Was their companion a phantom? Was the real one dying in the dark? The sun rose on a sleepless, haggard crew. They were no longer invaders or hunters. They were 6 broken men, hollow-eyed and haunted, starting at every shadow. Their greatest fear was no longer the spirit in the trees, but the man standing beside them. The Whispering Valley hadn't just trapped their bodies, it was devouring their minds. With the first touch of dawn, the spell of the night broke, but the horror remained. The 6 men stared at each other with wild, accusatory eyes. There was no talk of the mission, no mention of vengeance. The red-bearded leader, his face a pale, mud-streaked mask, simply pointed a trembling hand in the direction he prayed was east and croaked one word, "Out." It wasn't a retreat, it was a rout. They scrambled through the undergrowth, heedless of the branches that whipped their faces or the stones that turned their ankles. They just ran, driven by a primal need to escape the valley that had unmade them. And for the first time, Ahanu let them see him. He appeared on a sun-bleached bluff high above them, a stark silhouette against the morning sky. The sacred paint on his skin, stark black and white and red, made him seem less like a man and more like the valley's judgment given form. He held his bow but did not draw it. He simply stood, a silent, all-seeing witness to their flight. The sight shattered the last of their composure. A panicked cry went up, and their scramble turned into a blind stampede. Ahanu herded them with calculated precision. An arrow would splinter the rock beside a man veering too far north, sending him stumbling south. A hawk-like cry from the woods to their right would drive them left, funneling them toward the narrow, crumbling trail above Serpent River Gorge. They clawed their way along the treacherous path, with a sheer cliff on one side and a dizzying drop on the other. This was the final gate. As the last of the terrified men scrambled past a massive, precariously balanced dead tree leaning over the path, Ahanu put his shoulder to a large keystone rock at its base. With a groan of tortured wood and grinding stone, the deadfall moved. It tipped, hesitated for a heartbeat against the sky, and then plunged downward. It did not strike the men, but the trail they had just crossed. The impact was a deafening explosion of splintering timber and shattering rock that echoed through the entire valley. Dust and debris filled the air. When it settled, the path was gone, obliterated. On one side stood Ahanu. On the other, the 6 invaders, trapped on the outside, their only way forward now leading away from his home, forever. They stared back with hollow eyes at the impassable chasm, then turned and stumbled away, broken. Ahanu watched until they were out of sight. He then turned his back on the world of men and gazed upon the whispering valley. The silence that returned was deeper now, clean and sacred. The land was wounded, but it would heal. His war was over. His trail was once again one of peace. The seasons turned. The snows of 5 winters filled the invaders' forgotten tracks, and the sun of 5 summers coaxed new life from the scarred earth. The whispering valley healed itself with the slow, relentless patience of nature. Ahanu, his hair now streaked with gray like the granite of the cliffs, walked the old trails. One day his foot struck something hard beneath the pine needles. He knelt and unearthed a rusted axe head, its edge blunted, its body pitted and frail. The iron felt cold and dead. It was a relic from a bad dream, a memory of a fever that had broken long ago. He did not feel anger, only a distant pity. He dug a deep hole with his bare hands and buried the object, returning the last of the invaders' poison to the earth. He often stood in the clearing where the tall grandfather had fallen. The great stump was now a thriving nursery of its own, draped in emerald moss and sprouting ferns and fungi. Around it, a dozen young pines, children of the fallen giant, reached eagerly for the sun, their needles bright and new. The loss was still a space in the sky, but it was a space filled with light. One evening, he climbed once more to the sunstone ledge, the place where his war had begun. He looked out over the valley, now whole and unbroken in the golden light. The violent scar the invaders had carved was a faint green line, softened by saplings and shadow. The gorge where the trail had been obliterated was simply a cliff face, as if it had been that way for 1,000 years. The whispers in the valley were once again those of wind and spirit, not of fear. The warrior slept, the guardian watched, and the land, scarred but strong, endured. Years passed, and the valley's peace became Ahanu's own heartbeat. He grew old with the grace of the ancient pines, his movements slower, his wisdom deeper. The warrior's paint was a faded memory, replaced by the lines of age and sun etched into his skin. He believed his final trial was long past, and that he would one day simply lie down and give his spirit back to the soil he had so fiercely protected. One clear, cold night, under a sky littered with more stars than a man could ever count, Ahanu sat by a pool so still it was known as the sky mirror. He came here not to ask for anything, but to listen. The reflection was perfect, a second sky beneath the water, and he felt suspended between 2 heavens. As he watched, a single star blazed to life and shot across the darkness, a spirit arrow, a common and beautiful omen. But then, it did something he had never seen. Just before it vanished, the brilliant streak of light seemed to fracture, splitting into 2 distinct sparks. One fell far beyond the valley's borders into the dark lands of men. The other, smaller and fainter, fell within his sacred territory. Ahanu's breath caught in his chest. A sign so clear could not be ignored. The spirit of the valley, its guardianship, was broken in 2. One piece remained here, with him. The other had been cast out, lost in the world he had fought to keep at bay. The truth settled upon him, as cold and heavy as the river stones. The valley could not remain an island forever. His life was a closing circle, and there was no one to begin the next. His duty was not over. The spirits were not telling him to defend the valley's borders, but to leave them. He had to venture out into that hostile, unknown world to find the other half of the flame, to find the one who might carry the spirit of the guardian when he was gone. The peace in his heart was replaced by a profound and terrifying purpose. He looked up from the pool, his old eyes gazing past the familiar peaks that had been his only walls. For the first time in his long, solitary life, Ahanu's trail would lead him away from home. The preparation for this journey was unlike any other. For war, he had taken up weapons. For this quest, he gathered memories. He filled a small leather pouch not with arrowheads, but with sacred soil from beside the sky mirror pool. He wrapped a single perfect hawk feather with a strip of cured deer hide. He chose a smooth, dark stone from the riverbed, worn by 1,000 years of current, its coolness a familiar weight in his palm. These were not tools. They were anchors to hold on to in the storm he was walking toward. He stood at the edge of the gorge, the great chasm he himself had created years ago. It had been a barrier to keep the world out. Now it was a wall that held him in. He spent hours finding a new way, a treacherous goat path his younger self would have dismissed, his hands and feet finding holds in the ancient rock. The climb was slow, a struggle that mirrored the tearing of his own spirit. At the top on the far side he paused. He turned and looked back. The whispering valley lay below, a perfect secret world of green and shadow. The air he breathed was his air. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth. He raised a hand, not in farewell, but in a silent promise. Then he turned his back on his home and took his first step into the outer world. The change was immediate and brutal. The air lost its sweetness, replaced by a faint, acrid haze that stung the back of his throat. The sacred silence was gone, supplanted by a low, distant hum he did not recognize. The very light of the sun seemed harsh and unwelcoming, reflecting off land that was brown and scrubby, not lush and alive. The world here felt tired, its spirit thin. He looked back one last time at the jagged peaks of the valley, a fortress of solitude that was no longer his. Then he faced the hazy, unfamiliar horizon. The guardian was gone. In his place was a traveler, an old man walking into a world that had forgotten how to listen. His trail had begun. He walked for a day, following the strange, low hum. The land grew flatter, the trees scarcer. The earth was crisscrossed with old scars and fences that divided the ground into meaningless squares. Then he came upon it, a hard, black river that flowed with a terrifying speed. On its surface, fast, soulless beetles of painted metal roared past, their bright eyes cutting through the growing dusk of the July evening. The air was thick with their foul breath, a stench of hot metal and burnt fuel that made his stomach clench. Thirst gnawed at him. His own water skin was nearly empty. Across the black river, a single building pulsed with an unnatural red light, blinking a word he did not know. It was a beacon in the twilight, but it offered no warmth. He waited for a long gap between the metal beasts and crossed the river, his moccasins silent on the hard, gritty surface. As he drew closer, he saw a man standing beside his vehicle, bathed in the pale blue glow of a small rectangle in his hand, utterly oblivious to the world around him. Inside the building, through a large glass window, a family sat at a table, shoveling food into their mouths while staring at a flickering screen mounted on the wall. They shared a space, but they were not together. Ahanu pushed open a glass door that chimed softly. The air inside was cold and stale. A young man with wires in his ears sat behind a counter, his head bobbing to a rhythm only he could hear. He looked up, and his eyes widened, the music in his ears forgotten. He saw not an old man, but a specter from another time. The hawk feather in the graying hair, the sun-darkened skin, the buckskin clothing, and the eyes. Eyes that seemed to hold the weight of mountains and the patience of stones. Ahanu said nothing. He held up his water skin and gestured toward a spigot behind the counter. For a long moment, the young man simply stared, a flicker of fear in his eyes. Then, with a jerky nod, he took the water skin, filled it with a surprising speed, and pushed it back across the counter, avoiding Ahanu's gaze. He wanted this vision gone. Ahanu gave a slow, deliberate nod of thanks and retreated back into the night. He found a spot in the shadows of a scraggly tree and drank. The water was flat, tasting of metal and chemicals, a dead thing compared to the living water of his valley. He looked at the lonely building, a cage of light and noise in the vast darkness. He was searching for a spirit that could guard a sacred land. The people he saw here struggled to guard even their own attention. The quest, which had felt so pure and noble under the stars of his home, now felt impossibly vast. The trail ahead was colder and more foreign than he had ever imagined. He retreated from the highway's roar, finding a patch of overgrown darkness behind the glowing buildings. This was the world's forgotten space, a tangle of weeds and discarded things. He sat with his back against a peeling telephone pole, the rough wood a poor substitute for the living bark of a pine. He closed his eyes, clutching the small pouch of sacred soil, and tried to listen. But the world shouted too loudly. The drone of electricity, the distant wail of a siren, the clatter of a dumpster lid, these were the valley's new heartbeats, and they were sick. Despair, a cold and heavy blanket, began to settle over him. His quest felt like a fool's errand, a dying man's dream. He forced the feeling down. His father had taught him that a hunter who only looks for the deer will miss the broken twig that shows its path. He had been looking for a spirit like his own, a mountain peak in a flat, dead land. He was looking for the wrong thing. He needed to look for the tracks. He opened his senses again, not just his eyes and ears, but his spirit. He let the smells of the world wash over him, sorting them. Beneath the stench of exhaust and rotting food, there was another scent, faint but true, damp, tilled earth. He rose and followed it, moving silently along a rusted chain-link fence. And there, in the small, squared-off backyard of a modest house, he saw it. A patch of dark soil, no bigger than a grave, from which green life, beans, squash, tomatoes, was climbing toward a single yellow porch light. Someone was tending the land here. His gaze drifted from the garden to the dark pavement of a driveway beside it. There, drawn in chalk, were crude but unmistakable figures. One was a mountain, its peak sharp against an imaginary sky. Next to it was a bird with wide, powerful wings, a hawk, a child's drawings, a small garden. Ahanu's heart, which had felt like a cold stone in his chest, stirred with a flicker of warmth. It was not the roaring bonfire of a warrior spirit he had found. It was an ember, small, vulnerable, surrounded by darkness, but alive. It was the spirit of a gardener who fed the earth, the spirit of a child who still dreamed of hawks and mountains. He backed away from the fence, melting into the shadows. He would not go near, not yet. His mission was not to charge in, but to understand. The spirit arrow from the sky had not led him to a person, but to a place, a sign. The trail was no longer cold. He had found a track, faint and fragile, but it was there. He would watch. He would wait. He would listen. The night passed. For Ahanu, the waiting was a familiar language. He became a stone in the shadows, a knot of stillness in the restless world, his senses tracking the slow wheeling of the pale, city-dimmed stars. He watched the lights in the house go out, one by one, until only the single yellow porch light stood vigil. Dawn did not creep in with the soft touch of his valley. It was announced by the rumble of a distant garbage truck and the growing hiss of tires on the highway. The world of men was waking up. Just as the sky turned from black to a bruised purple, the back door of the house opened. A woman emerged, not with the hurried frenzy of the other people he had seen, but with a quiet, deliberate grace. A weariness clung to her like a shawl, but it was the weariness of a long journey, not the hollowness of defeat. In one hand she held a steaming mug. She knelt by the small garden, her bare feet pressing into the dew-damp grass. She didn't work, not at first. She simply watched the plants, her breath misting in the cool morning air. She took a sip from her mug, her eyes tracing the veins on a squash leaf. Then, with gentle, knowing hands, she plucked a single encroaching weed and straightened a climbing vine, guiding it back to its string trellis. It was a ritual, a prayer spoken with hands instead of words. Ahanu felt a powerful thrum of recognition. This was a person who listened to the earth. A moment later, the door opened again, and a small girl, no more than 7 or 8, ran out, her bare feet slapping on the pavement. She clutched a piece of paper. "Mama, look! I made the river." The woman turned, and the wariness fell from her face, replaced by a soft, genuine light. She took the drawing, a child's vibrant blue scrawl twisting between green and brown banks, and studied it with the seriousness one might afford a map. "It's beautiful, Maya," she said, her voice quiet. "It looks just like the creek we saw." She pointed a finger toward the sky. "Look, there's your hawk." A bird circled high above on the morning thermals. The girl gasped with delight, her eyes following the bird's path. From his hiding place, Ahanu watched, his heart full. The fractured star. He understood it now. The spirit was not in one person but in two. It was in the mother, the keeper of the soil, the quiet doer, and it was in the child, the seer of hawks and rivers, the dreamer, a root and a blossom together. The woman and child went back inside, their voices fading behind the closed door. Ahanu remained, the world of noise forgotten. He had found the keepers of the ember. Now, the trail became more difficult. He had to learn if that ember was strong enough to one day light a sacred fire, or if the first gust of wind would extinguish it forever. His vigil was over. His test was about to begin. The sun climbed, heating the pavement and baking the dry earth. Ahanu watched the rhythm of this new world unfold. He saw the woman, whose name he now knew was Sarah from her daughter's calls, get into one of the metal beetles and roar away. A short time later, the girl, Maya, was swallowed by a great yellow vehicle that lumbered down the street. The house fell silent. The land was empty. This was his time. He moved from the shadows, his moccasins making no sound on the grass. To step into their yard, a place defined by fences and property lines, felt like a profound violation, but his purpose was sacred. He went first to the garden. He saw the care in the neat rows, the strength in the plants. With a nod of respect, he chose a single tomato, the finest one, a perfect sphere of deep sun-ripened red. It was heavy and warm in his hand, a testament to the woman's skill. He walked to the back step, the place where mother and child had stood that morning. From the small pouch at his belt, he withdrew the hawk feather. It was long and clean, gray-brown barred with black, the central quill as strong and light as bone. It was a piece of his home, a symbol of clear sight and the spirit of the sky. He laid the perfect tomato on the painted wood of the step, and then gently placed the hawk feather beside it. A gift from the earth, blessed by the sky. It was a question posed in a language older than words. Would they see a piece of fruit and a cast-off feather? Or would they see an offering, a sign? He retreated to his hiding spot, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. He had risked a piece of his home, a piece of his spirit on this test. He was a hunter who had set a very particular kind of snare, one designed not to capture a body, but to reveal a soul. Hours passed. The sun began its long slide toward evening. Then he heard it, the familiar sigh of brakes from the yellow bus. A door opened, and soon the small figure of Maya came walking up the driveway. She would be the first to find it. Ahanu leaned forward, every fiber of his being focused on the small back step. He had asked his first question in the language of the earth. Now he would learn if anyone in this world still knew how to answer. Maya skipped up the driveway, swinging a brightly colored lunchbox. She was humming a tune from a cartoon, her mind a universe away, when she saw it. She stopped dead, her song cut short. On the top step, where there was nothing before, now lay the offering. From his hidden vantage point, Ahanu held his breath. The girl did not rush forward. She approached slowly, with the cautious curiosity of a fawn discovering a strange flower. She knelt, her eyes wide with a wonder that Ahanu hadn't seen in any other face in this world. She saw the deep red of the tomato, a fruit from her mother's own garden, and then her gaze locked onto the feather. It was the hawk's feather. Her hawk. She knew it instantly. Her small hand reached out, not to grab, but to revere. Her fingers traced the edge of the feather, a touch so gentle it barely disturbed the air. She looked around, her eyes scanning the yard, the fence, the trees. She was not afraid. She was searching for the source of the magic. She was still there, a small, silent guardian of the gift, when her mother's car pulled into the driveway. Sarah got out, her face etched with the day's fatigue, but it softened when she saw her daughter. "Maya, what have you got there?" "Mama, look," Maya whispered, pointing. "A gift." Sarah came over, her brow furrowed with mild concern until she saw the objects clearly. She saw the perfect tomato, one of her best, and understood it was not stolen, but presented. Then she saw the feather, flawless and wild, lying beside it. 100 other women might have seen a curiosity, or even a mess to be cleaned up. But Sarah, the gardener, the quiet listener, saw something else. She saw a message. She knelt beside her daughter. "You're right, sweetie. It is a gift." Her voice was soft. She looked around the yard, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Someone is saying thank you for the beautiful garden." She picked up the feather with a delicate touch. "And they've left you a blessing. A hawk's feather is very good luck." Together, they took the offering inside. From his hiding place, Ahanu saw them through the kitchen window. They didn't discard the feather. They placed it in a small left empty glass jar on the windowsill, right next to a pot with a tiny green seedling. It stood tall and proud, a wild spirit given a place of honor in their home. A long, slow breath escaped Ahanu's lips. The tension of his vigil drained away, replaced by a wave of certainty so powerful it felt like the sun warming his bones. They had answered. They had understood the language. The ember was not only alive, it burned brightly. The question was no longer if they were the ones. The question was how. How could the spirit of a mountain reach across the great chasm of worlds to a gardener and a dreamer? The trail ahead was no longer one of searching, but of introduction, and it would be the most perilous path he had ever walked. The answer had been given, and Ahanu's heart was settled. But a spirit born in sunlight and fair weather is a fragile thing. A guardian must be able to face the storm. As night fell on the edge of the great city of Chicago, whose lights devoured the stars in the eastern sky, the heavens offered the final test. A summer squall, borne over the plains, rolled in with unexpected fury. The sky, already hazy, turned a bruised black. Wind howled through the narrow spaces between houses, and rain fell in hard, driving sheets. The world beyond the windows became a thrashing chaos. From his shelter in a thicket of untended lilac bushes, Ahanu watched, as calm as the stone at the heart of a mountain. The lights in the house, and all up and down the street, flickered and died. A deep, sudden darkness fell, broken only by brilliant, jagged flashes of lightning. In one of these flashes, Ahanu saw Sarah at the back window, her face anxious. She was not looking at the sky, but at her garden. The wind was tearing at the plants, whipping the tall stalks of her tomatoes. Ahanu saw her make a decision. She grabbed a flashlight, threw on a coat, and plunged out into the deluge. The wind tore at her, but she fought her way to the largest plant, the one whose fruit had been part of his offering, and shielded it with her body while trying to secure it to its stake. The back door opened again, casting the small, wavering beam of a second flashlight. It was Maya. Though she flinched at each clap of thunder, she stood in the doorway, bracing against the wind, holding the light steady for her mother. They were a team, a gardener and a dreamer, fighting together for a small patch of earth against the rage of the sky. In that moment, Ahanu knew. They were not just keepers of an ember. They were its fierce protectors. They had the heart of guardians. As the storm's fury began to subside, leaving a world washed clean and dripping, Sarah, soaked and shivering, gave the plant one last gentle pat. She turned to her daughter with a tired, triumphant smile. It was then that Ahanu decided to step onto the trail's final path. He emerged from the shadows at the edge of their yard. He was not a threat, merely a presence. An old man, his buckskin dark with rain, his face a map of seasons. They both froze. The flashlights found him, but there was no scream. Maya, her eyes wide, lowered her light. "It's you," she whispered in awe. "The Hawkman." Ahanu took 2 slow steps forward and stopped. His voice, when he spoke, was the sound of wind through dry leaves. "The garden is strong," he said, his gaze meeting Sarah's. "You are strong." He held out his hand. In his palm was the small leather pouch he had carried from his home. "My quest is over," he said. "The Whispering Valley sent me to find its next heart. It sent me to you." He looked from the mother to the child. "This is its soil. It waits for you. When you are ready, the trail will show itself." Sarah, her mind reeling, stepped forward and took the pouch. Its leather was warm, and it seemed to thrum with a faint, living energy. This moment was impossible, yet it was the only thing that felt real. "Where will you go now?" Maya asked, her voice small. Ahanu smiled, a rare expression that softened the harsh lines of his face. He turned and looked west, toward the unseen mountains of his home. "My trail ends tonight," he said. "I am going home, to become the soil that awaits you." He turned from them and walked, not into the shadows, but through them. His form seemed to waver, to lose its solidness, dissolving into the rain-soaked darkness, until there was nothing left but the scent of cedar and clean earth. At that moment, the lights in the house flickered back on, casting a mundane yellow square onto the wet grass. Sarah and Maya stood together in the sudden glare, holding the small leather pouch. Sarah looked at her daughter's face, alive with impossible wonder. She looked at the city's glow reflected on the clouds overhead. And she looked at the pouch in her hand, a seed of a promise for a different world, a different life. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale. And don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.